Guys, it's God Bars here, the self proclaimed hip hop historian, and this is the 31st episode of my series where I grab a vinyl from my collection, talk about why I love it, what influence it had, and what its place is in the grand scheme of hip hop. So, if you watched my last video, you'll know the previous album I covered is extremely well known and pretty mainstream, as is the next album I'm going to cover after this one. So, with that in mind, I kind of wanted to sandwich in a more underground pick since I'm trying to cast as wide a net as possible. However, Atmosphere is an act where I've always had a kind of hard time placing their popularity. They've had some pretty big singles and seem to get regular work in a lot of festival circuits. They definitely had a crossover with the more suburban college crowd at the time, with songs like The Best Day or Sunshine. However, the two members of Atmosphere, the legendary producer Ann and the master MC Slug, were and are still well respected and had a massive scene in independent hip hop at the time. Formerly, Atmosphere also included member D-Spawn, but he would leave prior to the release of God Loves Ugly. The first album I was actually exposed to by Atmosphere was their 2003 LP, Seven's Travels, with the lead single Trying to Find a Balance. I came across that song in middle school, and it was unlike any of the hip hop I'd been exposed to up until that time. However, their debut album, Overcast, back in the late 90s, is another one of my favorite Atmosphere projects, and it features insanely raw flows and slick back and forths. Slug and Ant also founded the revolutionary independent label Rhymesayers, which I believe was kind of a counterpart to Def Jux at the time, though Rhymesayers would ultimately outlive Def Jux, with Rhymesayers still going to this day. However, through guys like Aesop Rock, there was an overlap between these two labels, and I feel like most fans of Rhymesayers are probably Def Jux fans and vice versa. It's also pretty ridiculous the amount of projects both legends have partaken in either before or during their work in Atmosphere, especially Slug, who was putting in an insane amount of work through multiple underground groups like Felt, his project with fellow independent titan Murs. Also, Deep Puddle Dynamics, a really dope short lived crew that I was sleeping on for a while. It mostly consisted of members from an even more experimental underground hip hop label at the time, arguably even more than Def Jux. That was, of course, Anticon, the California based independent label, home to way too big a roster for me to attempt to break down. But luckily, a few of the most notable names are the ones who took part in Deep Puddle Dynamics along Slug, like Soul, Alias, and Dose 1 of Cloud Dead. It doesn't even end there, because arguably my favorite Slug involved album that isn't by Atmosphere would be another underground crew that actually included Ant as well, or at least his production on their one album. I'm talking about Dino Spectrum, which aside from Slug and Ant featured I Self Divine, Sab the Artist, and Swift. But I've already spent too much time talking about albums that aren't God Loves Ugly, so for Dino Spectrum, all I can really say is go give it a listen, because it really blew me away when I first heard it, especially as an act I'd never heard of. Anyway, now that the stage is set and you sort of have an idea where Slug and Ant were at this point in their careers, I can get into God Loves Ugly, hands down my favorite Atmosphere album. I imagine this album was a bit polarizing at the time, because obviously today in hip hop, it's a lot more accepted for a rapper to be vulnerable, even depressed or suicidal, and to share that in their music. But this was back in 2002, and there really wasn't much mass appeal or marketability for the kind of ugly truth someone like Slug or Idea would expose. I have to give a quick little mention to Idea, who, if you don't know, he was one of the, if not the single best freestyler in the game until his tragic suicide in 2010. Slug and Idea have a killer old freestyle cipher on Sway way before it was the incarnation that we now know. This was back when Sway wore the really big hats, and Idea and Slug are just ripping this off the top cipher for a good 10 to 15 minutes, probably more if it wasn't edited down. These aren't just people throwing total gibberish at the wall or saying the same five words over and over again. Idea was a long-standing battle rap champion. In 1999, he won Scribble Jam, and this wasn't like, oh, you think of something in the car and spit it there. If anyone even caught a whiff of it not being completely off the top, you'd be booed off the stage. Even if it was completely off the top, rhymed really well, and made perfect sense, but was just kind of corny or something people felt like they heard before, you'd get booed off stage. Any slight choke and it was over. So there's a reason guys like Slug and Idea were revered and probably had a better chance to attempt this vulnerable music than someone someone who just popped up out of nowhere. The obvious issue that I'm sure these guys had to face at the time was the notion that this type of music was emo white boy rap or something along those lines. I can think of a specific experience where someone in middle school said that exact sort of thing about Idea, but back then those vulnerable themes hadn't really caught up in the culture yet. Now, when you look back at the three albums Idea did with DJ abilities, you can't help but be amazed with how ahead of his time he was. Not just with subject matter, but he was doing hard rock, almost metal influenced hip hop way before someone like Uzi or Cardi even started rapping. But out of all the hip hop albums over the years that would address these issues, I feel like God Loves Ugly is really the best example. Slug already had been developing his unique and clever writing style where he incorporates poetic metaphors and imagery but delivers it with a more everyman flow. And I say everyman for the lack of a better phrase, but it isn't remotely intended as an insult or a negative. His voice and delivery is kind of hard to describe, at least for me, but it's super distinct and instantly recognizable. And by everyman, I mean he isn't putting on any type of fake voice or even exaggerating his for an image. He's got one of those voices that's impossible to steal or really replicate because it's so filled with character and personality specific to Slug. I think it takes a lot of guts to just take your natural voice and go, no, this is me, I'm not changing that, because most people don't like the sound of their natural voice and want to use music as an opportunity for strangers to picture them differently than how they really are. But with Slug, he looks exactly how he sounds, he isn't hiding anything, and traditionally he's been vulnerable, honest, and self deprecating. It kind of reminds me of someone like Danny Brown, where they lay all their dark, embarrassing secrets out on the table, so then there's really nothing you can say to hurt them or bring them down. Honestly, I don't think Slug is even ugly per se, but regardless, this ongoing theme of kind of accepting your ugliness and finding the beauty and importance of it is really poignant to me. Another risk Atmosphere took on this album is not only does Ant do all the production, but there's only one feature on here in the form of Thyself Divine, which leaves Slug to hold the reins for the rest of this experience, at least lyrically, and despite over an hour of material, he was more than up to the task. Whatever zone these two were in just matched up perfectly, because track after track, God Loves Ugly reveals itself as another one of those albums that just gets better and better. Probably the most well-known song off this project is Fuck You Lucy, which is up there with Wildflower in terms of an angry, heartbroken message to a love lost. However, Wildflower by Ghostface has to be the most scathing and hilarious diss song to an ex-girlfriend where he's basically just running through a grocery list of her faults. While more direct in the title, Atmosphere's post-breakup song is a bit more nuanced and there's multiple moments where Slug says he's still in love with this girl and how he hates himself for it. This is one of those more vulnerable moments I was mentioning earlier, where instead of going the traditional route of not wanting to show any cracks in his armor and trying to convince the audience he's better off and happier without this girl, he instead opts to show how it isn't that simple. One other moment I have to talk about for a minute is Slug's first verse on the title track God Loves Ugly. While this entire song is maybe one of his best pieces of writing in general, obviously I can't just read the entire song, so I'll just share a few standout lines. After a little intro where these schoolgirls are commenting on how ugly he is, Slug comes in with, I wear my scars like the rings on a pimp, I live life like the captain of a sinking ship. In my personal favorite, Atmosphere, it's just a 10-letter word. Discretion is the name of my cement-feathered bird. Honestly, I could go on about this album all day, but for my three favorites, they'd probably have to be One Misphere, Fuck You Lucy, and the title track. But with a track list this dense, I have to give a few honorable mentions in the form of a song about a friend, love life, and a modern man's hustle. Thank you for watching my 31st video. As I mentioned at the beginning, the next one I talk about is going to be a pretty famous album. Now that I think about it, pretty much all of the last four of this group are pretty famous, notable albums, but this next one might have been the highest seller out of all of them, except maybe Kanye. I'm not sure which one of them sold better. So be sure to tune in next time to see what LP that is, and don't forget to let me know what your favorite songs off this underground landmark are. Don't forget to have a great day, and I'll see you next time, okay? Alright.